Have you ever thought about the basic rights we have today and what we would do without them? Women have only been allowed to vote for 102 years. Slavery was only abolished 155 years ago. Looking at all of history, this happened relatively recently. So who fought for these? Many people, but one woman, Jane Swisshelm, did her best to fight for her beliefs. Swisshelm was a very stubborn person, a trait that followed her through her life. Despite the many objections of her mother and her husband's mother, Swisshelm married her husband James in 1836. Although she went against her mother's wishes for her own happiness, the marriage between her and James turned out to be an unhappy one. James wanted her to be subservient to him, less of a wife and more of a servant. The problems in her marriage, despite causing her unhappiness, led her to become a strong advocate in the fight for women's rights. In 1838, Swisshelm and her husband moved to Louisville, Kentucky. Swisshelm had already been against slavery before moving, but in her new home, she was able to see it firsthand, which urged her to speak out against slavery. For a short period of time, Swisshelm was even a member of the Underground Railroad. In 1842, Swisshelm began sending stories and poems to papers in Philadelphia, and in 1844, her first byline appeared in a Pittsburgh newspaper. Since she was a woman, it was a struggle for her writings to get published, so she created her own abolitionist newspaper in 1847, Pittsburgh Saturday Visitor, which eventually catapulted her to national fame. Although her stance on slavery was rigorous, she had a much less aggressive manner when speaking on women's rights. She insisted that women not make any unreasonable demands, for the fear that the movement as a whole would be rejected. Even so, she joined the chorus speaking out for the rights of women. By 1850, Swisshelm's newspaper, and Swisshelm herself, had grown to such popularity that the editor of New York Tribune gave her a job as a freelance reporter. She was able to spend many weeks in Washington, D.C., describing the political life in the nation's capital. She was even able to convince Vice President Millard Fillmore to let her sit in the reporters' area in Congress, making Swisshelm the first woman to sit in the Senate press gallery. Unfortunately, shortly after, Swisshelm lost her job when she published an unconfirmed sex scandal in her newspaper. Swisshelm left her husband in 1857 and moved to St. Cloud, Minnesota. Here, she reestablished her newspaper as St. Cloud Visitor, and she continued writing about her beliefs. Some of the editorials she wrote denounced slave owners for bringing slaves into free territory. This upset a group of men in support of slavery, and they broke into her newspaper office, where they trashed the room and destroyed Swisshelm's printing press, tossing the printing press into the Mississippi River. Later, Swisshelm bought a new printing press and established a new anti-slavery newspaper titled St. Cloud Democrat. Now, while Swisshelm was an incredible female journalist who fought for what she believed in, she was not always on the right side of history. While living in Minnesota, she grew to hate the Dakota Native American tribe. At first, she thought the Native Americans and the white settlers could live peacefully, until the tribe attacked a group of white settlers. Despite the reason for attacking being that the Native Americans were not being provided food and payment by the government, which they were supposed to be receiving. During the Dakota War, Swisshelm printed editorials calling for the murder of all Native Americans, referring to them as wild beasts. Most people are appalled by this part of her history not being known. While Swisshelm paved the way for many women wanting to pursue journalism and advocated strongly for women's rights and the abolition of slavery, we must still recognize her hateful editorials calling for the killing of all Native Americans. After selling the St. Cloud Visitor in 1863, she volunteered as a Civil War nurse. Swisshelm eventually retired to Swissvale, Pennsylvania, where she died in 1884. She is now buried in Allegheny Cemetery in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Swisshelm has a plaque at St. Cloud University that details part of her legacy.